Welcome to the Humanity Mosaic podcast, exploring authenticity and connection with Dr. E. Thank you for joining us today as we explore issues that affect our relationships in today's world. And now welcome to today's episode with Dr. E.
Hello, everyone. So happy to be with you today. And once again, I don't like to have things boring going on if you're going to tune in and listen. So we've got a really fantastic guest for you to listen to today. Anu Gupta is the author of Breaking Bias, with his foreword that comes from and is written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I'm impressed already, okay? He trained as a lawyer, a scientist, and a social entrepreneur, and he is sought after as a speaker whenever people really need somebody to really speak to what's going on with bias in this world. In 2014, he founded Be More with Anu, a DEIB and wellness training company that has brought his NSF-funded methodology to hundreds of thousands of professionals and more than 300 organizations, impacting over 30 million lives. As a queer immigrant of color, he came to the work of breaking bias after almost ending his life due to lifelong experiences with racism and homophobia. I have to pause there for a moment, because even in introducing him in this way, I know how that affects so many of our marginalized people in the world. And today we get an opportunity to speak to someone who has lived a life having to really struggle with all of the things that society does to marginalize us when we don't fit the dominant norm. The realization that bias can be unlearned and helped to lead him out of the dark point and inspired a lifelong mission to build a global movement for social healing based on principles of mindfulness and compassion. I now welcome to the stage Anu Gupta.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. E. It's such a privilege.
It's so wonderful to be talking to you today as we sit here, I guess just a few days away from a new president being put into the Oval Office in a country that is divided by bias. And as we sit here in confused anticipation for the future, I cannot think of anyone that I would rather be talking to today than you.
Thank you. Yeah, let's see what happens in this conversation. It is a really challenging time for our humanity, and I know we've been here before. We've done hard things. We can continue to do hard things. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Anu, here we are in not just a country divided, but a world divided, really. We know that bias exists everywhere. We know that oppression exists everywhere. And I've always said that it is not necessarily the people who are oppressed or marginalized who will solve this, but it will be the oppressor who eventually recognizes that what you do to me, you also do to yourself.
Yes.
So looking at where we are today, what are some of your thoughts about steps forward that we need to begin to take?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that question. It's a very, very big question. And, I'll have to just invoke my ancestors here, that I carry with me, their stories, their legacies, both from India and the freedom fighters there, but also the civil rights movement in the United States and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So just kind of holding all those people and, asking them for strength as I respond to you. But, here's where I'd love to begin, which is, in my book, Breaking Bias, which just came out, I really wanted to give people an understanding of what bias is, there is a misperception in our world that we're born with biases. Actually, all forms of biases, whether they're racial bias, gender bias, sexuality bias, age bias, size bias, you name it, are learned habits. There are some conscious biases, which are learned false beliefs, and unconscious biases, which are learned habits of thoughts. And what bias does is that it distorts how we perceive, read, and remember, and make decisions. So part of what's happened in our world today, because it's a global challenge, is that we've been trained to see ourselves and one another through the prism of these false stories, false beliefs. And our brains have been wired with these biases. And the other thing that I found in my research and deep study is that the way our current paradigm is actually quite recent. If you think about the world, the globalized nature of it, it's just become interconnected in the last 500 years, less than 500 years, right? There've always been hundreds, possibly thousands and thousands of settled societies and cultures that have existed. And not all of them were rooted in this idea of bias. Many, many, many of them, as scientists are beginning to discover, archaeologists, historians, and writing about, are actually quite egalitarian, and they're rooted in these animist conceptions of being one with one another and the living earth, our natural world. So I think what's happened for me is, as I reflect on what's to happen in the next couple of weeks, but also what's happened in the last couple of months and couple of years, what's happening right now is actually perfect timing. It's like perfect timing and divine timing, because that all of that hatred, that greed, that ignorance, known as the three poisons in the Buddhist tradition, has been operating under the surface, and now it's fully fledged out there. It's like the dragon is out, right? The dragon of empire, the dragon of oppression, of domination, of hatred, of competition, of greed, of constant extraction. And it's really up to humans like you and I to begin to participate in this process of shifting consciousness. So if I were to think about breaking bias, it's really the work of evolving our consciousness, elevating our collective consciousness through this process of neuro-decolonization. Like, we really have to decolonize and uproot these fictions that divide us from ourselves and one another. And this was my journey, my story of how I believed these false ideas about myself because of my color and sexuality and ethnicity, because these are just made up, to really remember who we actually are and how we relate to ourselves, one another, and the natural world, because this isn't just a problem of suffering that humans are experiencing globally, but also our fellow living beings are experiencing. Our earth is crying.
It's very true. As I listen to you, it touches my heart, the recognition that I've always said, and I have felt like that voice crying out in the wilderness, that what is not surfaced will not be addressed. And when we were in this place a few years back, and everyone was so shocked at the results of the election, something that I knew, I was not shocked, I was not surprised, and that's because I had been doing this work just as you have been in organizations, and I could feel the seething anger, the seething rage underneath the surface. And what was very painful about that for me was the recognition that we really were not working on elevating our consciousness. We're just sort of stuck in place.
Yeah.
And, I don't use the word minorities. I use the word love warriors. I don't want anyone who is marginalized to begin with to think of themselves as a minority. And if you're talking about people of color, we're not a minority. But when we look at the way that we have been taught to not even respect our own humanity, where we have to begin.
Mm.
And I like to give people a little window into looking at whether or not you have paid attention to respecting and loving yourself.
Right.
Because you can't do these horrible, oppressive things to other people without them coming from a place of lovelessness within you. How, and you know, your book is so beautifully scientifically based. You know, you've really gotten us deep into the concepts of how this all begins. But I really would like for you to speak to how each of us
Yeah.
as human beings, how we have developed this sense of less than or more than. What's that all about, Anu?
You know, this is the crisis of modernity, which really began, you know, in the late 1400s with the end of the Spanish Inquisition, as well as, you know, the colonization first of the Americas, then every other place in the global South, you know, populated by melanated people. And it's a crisis of disembodiment and disconnection. So being, you know, there's a famous falsehood, you know, that, you know, Cartesian falsehood, I think, therefore I am. So we're just here, you know, this is who we are. But actually, there is a being that exists neck down, not even neck down, eyes down, right? That we each human is and are. And this has been the wisdom of every spiritual tradition in the world, you know, whether it's rooted in a god or a divinity or not, even, you know, atheistic traditions. And part of why misogyny, patriarchy, racism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, whatever you want to call it, any form of domination system that exists out there, it's really creates a hierarchy that's disconnected with our bodies first. And for a lot of animist and indigenous scholars, it's really not just disconnection with our bodies, it's disconnection from nature itself. So I've been a deep Buddhist practitioner for a long time. And in my meditation retreats and practice, one of the things that a lot of teachers have taught me, and the Buddha himself said, is nature isn't separate from who we are. We actually are nature. And everything that happens to us, around us, is a consequence of causes and conditions. And these causes and conditions are a product of each one of our individual thoughts, words, and deeds, moment to moment. So for me, as I think about this moment, right, that we've all been a part of, and poor Kamala Harris, like, she was given a very short period of time to do something that was much beyond her. There have been millions and millions of causes and conditions that have been planted for this moment to be surfaced, right? And as you alluded to, even had she won, we would have been operating in a very, very imperfect system where we're looking away, averting from all the things that need to be looked at. Like in the United States, we have yet to reconcile our history, our incredibly violent history. How is it that within a less than 200-year period, we move our borders from one, you know, part of the continent to the other and extend them to Hawaii and even beyond to Guam? Like, part of that, there's a historical amnesia. But the body keeps the score, the psyche keeps the score. And this is very true, not just for those of us who are marginalized and subordinated because of our color or sexuality or gender, but also those of us who are in the dominant group, who have been the oppressor. Because in order for them to continue the, you know, enterprises, these were business ventures of enslavement, of genocide, of destruction of the living earth and of animals, they had to kind of surpass and transcend the wails and the screams and the pain of millions of humans and other living beings.
Right.
And what does a human thinking, sensing, conscious being have to do to suppress that? It has to be completely disembodied and disconnected. So I think for me, it's really the root cause of this is our crises of disconnection from our body and really disembodiment that really began in the age of modernity, when we started wanting things in the external world, conquering, dominating the earth, creating enterprises, but at the expense of our own bodies, our own relations. And that's where we find ourselves today, and we're at a precipice. If you think about, in the book, I really talk about how in the last 100 years, there has been an advent of inclusion consciousness. If the last 500 years have been rooted in like hatred and division and what I call exclusion consciousness, there has been the establishment of the Human Rights Charter, the UN, liberation movements for women, for people of color, for many, many other subordinated humans, and also concern for our earth and other living beings. So that's shifting. But that energies of domination and competition and selfishness that are just the hungry ghosts are still around. They're percolating, and they're really coming to be seen and to be vanquished now.
It's very painful to talk about or even think about the reality that it is so important for people to wake up. We're not going to become conscious or elevate our consciousness without waking up. And of course, the quote that man will not solve the problems of today from the same level of consciousness that they were created. We have to elevate our consciousness. And when we talk about that, I don't like to feel like we're talking above people's heads.
Yeah.
What does elevate your consciousness mean?
Yeah.
And one of the things that, as you well know, in my teaching of the Enneagram, is that I try to move people away from this notion that we are just talking heads, that all of the wisdom, that everything is just in our head, in our brain. But there's not just the wisdom of the thought processes that we actually channel, the downloads that we receive, the information that we retain there, but there's the wisdom of our emotional center, of our hearts. And then there is the wisdom of the body. The body speaks to us, which we often talk about that in terms of even our intuitive center, our instinctive center in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
And aligning all of those centers so that we can do the work of elevating based on not just being disembodied heads. So much of what we are experiencing right now really comes from a place of people not even being able to hear each other, not being able to listen, and not being able to listen with any level of empathy or compassion.
Yeah.
And I have to say that on my team, one of my team members was always there to remind us, that we did not want to fall into the default of demonizing the people that we don't necessarily agree with. And this is where we are right now. We're at a place where we are all very divided. Both sides believe that they are holders of the truth.
Right.
Truth,
Right.
And whenever you believe that, you need to start running from yourself, because, it's not an either or world. We have to move more to a both and sense of being in the world.
Yeah.
But with these divisions, particularly for those of us who want to participate in the healing and reconnection of our humanity, the healing and the capacity to participate in the humanity mosaic, recognizing that anyone who does not step forward and do their part, the spaces around them will remain empty because other people can't fit in.
Right.
Kind of walk us through just some small steps that we can take to try to come together, to move towards one another, rather than continuing to alienate each other. This is the work that, I feel like I'm in the trenches in every day.
Right.
Not alienation, but connection, reconnection,
Right.
remembering that love is what will guide us there. Give us some words of wisdom on that, Anu.
Such a beautiful question. And these are the types of inquiries that I myself am kind of delving deeper into myself. So I certainly don't have the answer, but I can share my own journey around this. And what I've written in the book is also a product of this. I started writing the book the day January 6th happened, 2021. I'd never thought I would be writing a book at this point, particularly a book called Breaking Bias. And something inside of me said that I've trained so many people around the world and really talking about bias, demystifying it, and doing it from a place of compassion that's trauma-informed, that's shame-free, to really bring people together, and just seeing that it was not even a drop in the bucket. And then seeing what's happened with this election has kind of reaffirmed that that's where our collective consciousness is, right? So on the one hand, this work is of deep acceptance, of deep patience, and I really feel ultimately it's deeply spiritual work. Any successful social movement of the past, when I think about my own forefathers in India with the Indian independence movement against an atrocious, violent British regime, or the civil rights movement in the United States, they were deeply spiritual movements that were powered by joy and love and connection and song. And I think our recent movements for social change have kind of been missing that soul, that spirit. So how do we do that? Like, that's your question is, well, okay, great. You've given me an intellectual download, but what do we do? And I think for me, the invitation really is to begin with ourselves. Just as we're not able to hear others and feel impatient, we're not able to hear our own selves. And this is the nature of disconnection and disembodiment that we've inherited from our society, this overly stimulated society. And what I share in the book is, for any kind of bias in the world, there are 5 causes, and then there are 5 solutions. So the first inquiry that's important, because our mind is the one that constantly keeps us trapped, right, into rights and wrongs and shoulds and should nots. So it's really important to begin to acknowledge the 5 causes of bias. And I'll give an example, in this case of racial bias, for example. For every bias, the foundation cause is a story, a false story of a human hierarchy that was completely fabricated. So this idea of race that's, global now, was created less than 300 years ago, by a bunch of dudes who collected skulls. And they infected the global consciousness with this idea, basically superiority and inferiority of humans for no other reason than a chemical known as melanin in their skin. Right? I mean, just if you think about it from a distance, like if there was an alien that were to come here, they would think we're completely insane.
It's true.
We've just been punked. And yet so many of us, including myself, have caused so much suffering to ourselves and one another, believing in this false story. So for me, the important thing with the book is to really begin to acknowledge where the story comes from, and to really depersonalize it, see it for what it is, heal from it, its impacts, and then begin to see the fullness of who we are as a human being. And then the other 4 causes are really policies, social contact, education, and media. And that's basically day to day, the inputs we take and the realities that become and manifest as bias in our lives. So that's good, right? We know how we're trained in these biases, but then how do we untrain ourselves? And this is where the PRISM toolkit comes in. And PRISM is 5 tools that help us first, feel closer to ourselves, address those internalized biases because of our identities. And then we can do it for others at an interpersonal level. And that starts with M, actually, mindfulness, becoming aware of these stories, these stereotypes, their somatic response in the body, the emotions that are connected to it. And that's really important. And then we move to stereotype replacement, which is creating new mental models, right? If we think of a stereotype, in the lab, for Black men, think of Dr. King, think of Nelson Mandela, think of your own partner or friend or an immigrant person, a brown immigrant man, right? Think of me. So we're creating new mental models of people that don't hold those stereotypes. So it's beginning to alleviate that neurons that fire together, wire together. We're creating new neural circuitry. Then we move to individuation, which is dissociating stereotypes from the individual. So if I'm with Dr. E, I'm really with Dr. E and the fullness of the human she is. And that requires curiosity, interest, patience, and that's kind of how we're really beginning to slow down our nervous system. And then we move to hard practices, pro-social behaviors for R, that are things like cultivation of compassion, empathy, loving kindness. So part of our expectation in this fast-paced world is that we should just be born with it. We say, I'm compassionate, it should just come up. No, these are hard practices. These are things to cultivate. Spending 10 to 15 minutes, 20 minutes a day, really cultivating these practices. And what they're doing at the neural level is they're beginning to shift the valence, the affect, the fear that undergirds bias, the fear of the other. And that's really important because it's not just an intellectual experience, bias. It's a whole somatic experience. Safety is a big part of it. And then we move to perspective taking, which is just imagining what it's like to be in the shoes of another being. This is what great actors do, right? They're not that person, but all of us have that capacity, and it really kind of begins to dispel that separation that we feel from others. But just as we do this for others, we can do this for ourselves. And this is really important. Like most of us, having been raised in 20th or 21st century, have experienced such transformation in our own lifetimes with technology, with media, with education, with culture. Like for me, like being uprooted from my own culture in India and moving to the United States and adapting to this new culture, there's a lot of pain there. So imagining what it's like for me, like I had to practice perspective taking for who I was as an 8-year-old, as a 12-year-old, as a 15-year-old, and really offering myself the fullness of that experience. And I feel like this is how I'm changing my own consciousness, becoming aware of who I am, because authentically, beyond the amness, there's that I, as so many other teachers have talked about. But we forget about that. And then we begin to appreciate that in others. And even when there's nonsense around us, we're able to see the nonsense for what it is, and also begin to, with curiosity, see the I amness of the human that's perpetuating that nonsense, how they're so deeply rooted in, ignorance. They're so deeply rooted in fear, in greed, and these energies that need to shift. And ultimately, the only way to transform these energies, and this is basically for me, my ancestral work, is through compassion, is through love, is through patience, is through curiosity. By telling them that they're wrong or they're bad or they're evil, that's not going to get us anywhere. I mean, it hasn't so far. No. I don't know why we expect different results.
No, it's not going to get us anywhere. And as I always say, the great unifier is love. And as much as we would like to be able to extend love to everyone, to every person, to all beings, love our planet as well, the challenge is that you can only love others as well as you can love yourself.
Amen.
And people have not figured that out. So my invitation to all of humanity is to start with yourself. Amen. Start to look at the way you treat yourself. Start to look at these false narratives that you run in your head and that you allow yourself to believe. Start to recognize that the things that happen, particularly things that are sort of trauma-induced, don't run away from them, rather explore them so that you can heal them. Because I say this over and over, if we don't surface anything that we do not surface will not be explored. And if it is not explored, we will not heal it. As we started out saying, this moment in time is quite sacred. And we have a huge opportunity. May not feel like an opportunity, but in reality, it is. And your work is out there now. It wasn't out there 200 years ago. It
Yeah.
wasn't there 100 years ago, but it's out there now. Both of us are doing work in the world to help people begin to look at themselves,
Yeah.
look at the inner work process, and take that journey back to your authentic self. And one of the things, I'm curious if you feel in a similar fashion to how I feel about this. We talk about falling out on the right side of history, looking back in time. Where did you stand when certain things were happening in the world? And what will you say to your children and your grandchildren about the position that you took
Right.
when in critical moments,
Right.
of time? I know, this comes as a surprise to some people, but I have a tremendous number of people who fit the dominant norm who are working with me because they have a disconnect from their children, because their children are angry with them
Right.
because of the position that they have taken around bias and bigotry.
Yeah.
And these younger people who seem to start off at a higher level of consciousness are looking at their parents and their grandparents and saying, wake up. It's
Yeah.
a different world. It's a different day.
Yeah.
You see young people having more diversity in their friends, and connecting across differences in beautiful ways,
Right.
learning to love one another and to love themselves.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I've been inviting people to do is to jump online and to engage in the Harvard implicit bias testing, and to go and to choose categories.
Yeah.
Just choose some categories and check out your own bias, because we all have it. We
Yeah.
didn't ask for it. We didn't necessarily say, here I am, I'm an open drawer waiting for you to fill me up with biases, but we got them.
Yeah.
And, working with it now is something that we have to encourage people to do.
In a shame-free way, right? So yeah, that's exactly it. Because these are the 5 causes of bias. That's how we've got these biases, right? We didn't choose to be born in these times, but we were exposed to a certain media. We were given a certain education. We had certain friends and family members that trained us in learning about ourselves and one another, and in separation consciousness, right? Exclusion consciousness. So I think part of the invitation is to begin to see that. 2 things I'll say about, first is, one doesn't have to do this work alone, right? So in the book, I've put so many resources and communities that folks can use to really have to use as support, various modalities that I've used personally to break bias or just to heal from the harm of bias, from EMDR to somatic experiencing to more indigenous-based practices. And it's really important for folks to explore these opportunities and also know that they exist. They don't have to just sit there and be like, oh my God, what are my biases? No, that's not it. It's really a more dynamic process. But, beyond that, I think for me, as I think about just the evolution of this work and evolution of human consciousness as a whole, even people that are not able, when you shared that people oftentimes worry, they basically worry about what they will tell their kids and grandkids where they were. I don't prescribe to that rights and wrong, because it's so deeply individual. And the folks that are unable and unwilling to speak, that's where their consciousness is. And we can't force it on them out of shame. And also, they have to learn their lessons, over the period of their own life. And if they're in fear, if they're afraid of losing their job, or if they're afraid of, whatever the fear may be that's preventing them from speaking up and organizing, we meet them there with compassion. And I think for me, I think the rights and wrongs, being on the right versus, I think for me, I really prescribe to what Rumi said, that beyond rights and wrongs, there's a field, and I'll meet you there. So we really have to really be beyond these rights and wrongs and this dualistic way of thinking, and make that invitation from a place of love, like you said, from a place of, common humanity, because that's what's like heart filling. And I feel like the reason why we are where we are today, particularly in our politics, is folks on the left and progressives have really failed to create a sense of belonging for people. There's a lecture I went to a couple of weeks ago, and the speaker really talked about how belonging precedes beliefs. So I have members of my own family that voted for the administration that's going to be sworn in, and they love me. They know I'm a queer person. They love my partner. They are so supportive of my book. They've bought like dozens of copies and they've shared it with all their friends. But none of that is connected to their political choice.
Yeah. We have seen that quite a bit in this particular election. Go back to the issue of shaming. I always say that shame, blame, and fear are paralytics. They hold you in place, and they don't do anything to help you evolve, nor do they help anyone around you. And looking at where you are, how you feel about where you are, how you feel about what your energy is adding to the collective consciousness is such an important thing. And I say all the time, everything we do and everything that we say matters.
Yeah. Every thought word indeed.
I know I was doing a lot of thinking and trying to manifest certain outcomes, and wanting so much to see, and I'll be very honest, I wanted to see a woman, step up into this position. I feel like the entire earth, the entire world needs more of the divine feminine energy now. I feel like we all could use a little nurturing in a way where we grow more loving kindness towards ourselves, and therefore can give more loving kindness back out into the world.
Agree.
But it doesn't just happen spontaneously by itself. And you don't go to bed one night and wake up the next morning as a person who is putting lots of loving kindness out into the world, or who suddenly love yourself. It is a practice. It does take work. When we say to people, you have to do the work, the inner work, you have to go deep inside. And as Father Richard Rohr always says, go deep down inside and find out what's there, but then up and take responsibility for all of it. So it's a personal inventory that we must all learn to engage in. And it does begin with self. It does not begin with, until we find our own core and center and are grounded and no longer disembodied, everyone on the other side of us will remain other.
Yes.
That is what we're trying to move away from.
Yes.
But it takes work. It takes work. So that's one of the reasons that I am so grateful that you have put your book out into the world, that you're still going into organizations and fighting the good fight.
Thank you.
And that we continue to be colleagues in this love battle for a kinder and gentler world, where we can all love ourselves and love others in a way where everyone knows that they belong, because we're all connected. Anu, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Much here today.
And thank you. And thank you for being part of my beloved community. This is our work together to shift consciousness.
Right. And everyone, I want you to just make breaking bias fly off the shelves. Like, to just please, when I say it is work, but it is some of the best work that you will ever do, to come home to your authentic self. But we need tools, we need guides, we need something to help us get there. And Anu has graciously provided us with some wonderful tools to be able to live in a more loving and kind way. Thank you for being with us today, Anu.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and excited to be on this journey with you.
As am I. I love you.
Love you too.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Humanity Mosaic podcast with Dr. E. For more information, please visit deboraheggerton.com and be sure to check out theauthenticselfcommunity.com to continue your journey.